It was a quiet morning in the small town of Brookfield, a place where everyone knew everyone, or so they thought. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a golden glow over the streets, but beneath the surface of this picturesque town simmered tensions that no one liked to talk about. Racism, though rarely spoken of openly, was woven into the fabric of daily life, hidden behind polite smiles and hushed conversations. And in the center of it all was Officer Greg Harris, a man who wore his badge like a shield, convinced that his authority made him untouchable. Greg wasn't just any cop. He was the kind who saw the world in black and white, literally. His prejudices ran deep, shaping every decision he made on the job. To him, certain people didn't belong in Brookfield, and he made it his mission to remind them of that. But today, Greg's arrogance was about to collide with a reality he never saw coming. Because today, he would cross paths with a man who would change everything, a man named Marcus Johnson. Marcus wasn't just passing through town. He was there for a reason, though no one knew it yet. Dressed in a sharp suit and carrying himself with an air of quiet confidence, he stood out like a beacon in the sleepy town. But to Greg, Marcus didn't look like a man of importance. He looked like a target, and that mistake would cost Greg more than he could ever imagine. This is the story of how a racist cop's worst day became a lesson for an entire town, a story of justice, karma, and the power of standing up against prejudice. Brookfield was the kind of town where time seemed to stand still. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was a place where neighbors waved to each other from porches and children played freely in the streets. But beneath its idyllic surface, Brookfield had a darker side, one that whispered through the town like a ghost. It was a place where prejudice lingered in the shadows, unspoken but ever present. And at the heart of it all was Officer Greg Harris, a man who embodied the town's unspoken biases. Greg wasn't just a cop. He was a product of his environment, raised in a family that believed in strict hierarchies and outdated stereotypes. He had grown up seeing the world through a lens of division. To him, the badge on his chest wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a weapon, one he wielded with pride. He patrolled the streets with a swagger, his sharp eyes always scanning for what he called troublemakers. But in Greg's mind, trouble had a very specific face, and it wasn't one that looked like his. On the other side of town, Marcus Johnson walked with purpose. He wasn't from Brookfield, but he had business that would soon shake the town to its core. Marcus was a man who commanded attention without saying a word. His tailored suit, polished shoes, and confident stride set him apart from the casual attire of the townsfolk. He moved like someone who knew his worth. His calm demeanor, a stark contrast to the tension that seemed to follow him like a shadow. As Marcus strolled down Main Street, he couldn't help but notice the curious glances thrown his way. He was used to it. Being the only black man in a place like this always drew attention. But today, those glances would turn into something far more dangerous. Because today, his path would cross with Officer Greg Harris, and the encounter would change both their lives forever. Officer Greg Harris was cruising down Main Street when he spotted Marcus Johnson. From the moment his eyes landed on the well-dressed black man, Greg's instincts, or rather, his prejudices, kicked into overdrive. To him, Marcus didn't belong here. He was too polished, too confident, too different. In Greg's mind, that made him suspicious. Without a second thought, Greg pulled his patrol car over and stepped out, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, as if he expected trouble. "Hey, you," Greg called out, his voice sharp and commanding. Marcus paused, turning to face the officer with a calm expression. He didn't look startled or afraid, just curious. "Can I help you, officer?" Marcus asked, his tone polite but firm. Greg didn't like that. He was used to people shrinking under his authority, not meeting his gaze with such quiet confidence. "What are you doing here?" Greg demanded, stepping closer. His eyes scanned Marcus from head to toe, lingering on the suit as if it were a costume. "This is a quiet town. We don't get many strangers around here." The pause before the word strangers was deliberate, loaded with meaning. Marcus didn't miss it, but he didn't rise to the bait. "I'm just passing through," he replied evenly. "Is that a crime?" Greg's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Marcus. "Let me see some ID," he snapped, holding out his hand. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and handed over his driver's license. Greg studied it like it was a piece of evidence in a criminal case. "Marcus Johnson, huh? What brings you to Brookfield, Mr. Johnson?" "Business," Marcus replied simply. He didn't elaborate, and that only made Greg more suspicious. "Business? Huh? What kind of business?" Greg pressed, his voice rising. Marcus remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a warning, perhaps, or a challenge. "That's personal," he said. "Unless it's against the law, too. Have business in this town?" Greg's face flushed with anger. He wasn't used to being talked to this way, and he wasn't about to let it slide. "Listen here," he growled, stepping even closer. "I don't like your attitude. You think you can just waltz into my town and act like you own the place? I don't know what you're up to, but I'm not letting you get away with it." Before Marcus could respond, Greg grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. "You're under arrest," he barked, pulling out his handcuffs. Marcus didn't resist, but his calm demeanor never wavered. "On what charges?" he asked, his voice steady. Greg hesitated for a moment, then spat out, resisting arrest and suspicious behavior. "Now get in the car." As Greg shoved Marcus into the back of the patrol car, a small crowd had begun to gather. People whispered and pointed, but no one intervened. Marcus sat quietly, his expression unreadable. He knew this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. And as Greg drove off, his chest puffed with self-righteousness. He had no idea just how much his life was about to change. The drive to the police station was tense, the silence in the patrol car thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Greg Harris kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowing as he studied Marcus Johnson. Marcus sat calmly in the back seat, his hands cuffed, but his posture relaxed. He didn't fidget or complain. He simply stared out the window, taking in the passing scenery as if he were on a casual drive, rather than being hauled off to jail. Greg didn't like that. He wanted Marcus to squirm, to show some sign of fear or regret. But Marcus gave him nothing. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Greg finally sneered, breaking the silence. "Walking around like you own the place, acting all high and mighty. Well, let me tell you something, people like you don't last long in Brookfield. By the time I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd never set foot here." Marcus didn't respond. He just continued to gaze out the window, his expression unreadable. Greg's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "You hear me?" he snapped. "You're nothing but a troublemaker, and I'm going to make sure you pay for it." When they arrived at the station, Greg marched Marcus inside with a sense of triumph. He shoved him toward the booking desk, where a few of his colleagues were lounging, sipping coffee and chatting. "Look what I caught," Greg announced, his voice dripping with pride. "This guy was causing trouble downtown. Thought he could get away with it, but not on my watch." The other officers glanced at Marcus, their expressions a mix of curiosity and indifference. One of them, a younger cop named Danny, raised an eyebrow. "What did he do?" he asked. Greg hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Suspicious behavior. Resisting arrest. You know the type." Danny frowned, but didn't press further. Marcus, still silent, was led to a holding cell. As the heavy metal door clanged shut behind him, Greg leaned in, a smirk on his face. "Enjoy your stay," he said mockingly. "It's going to be a long night for you." But as Greg walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Marcus's calmness was unnerving, almost as if he knew something Greg didn't. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into Greg's mind, but he quickly pushed it aside, convincing himself that he was in control. After all, he was the cop, and Marcus was just another criminal. Or so he thought. The police station was quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the air as Officer Greg Harris leaned back in his chair, basking in what he thought was a job well done. He had just finished filing the report on Marcus Johnson, embellishing the details to make himself look like the hero of the day. But his smug satisfaction was short-lived. The station doors burst open, and in walked a man in a crisp suit, his face stern and his presence commanding. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Greg recognized him immediately. It was Chief Deputy Roberts, one of the highest-ranking officials in the state police. "Where is he?" Roberts demanded, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Greg stood up, confusion written all over his face. "Where's who, sir?" he asked, trying to sound confident. Roberts didn't even look at him. "Marcus Johnson. Where is he?" Greg's stomach dropped. "He's in the holding cell," he stammered. "But sir, he's just some troublemaker I picked up downtown." He was open the cell. Now, Robert's tone left no room for argument. Greg fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he led the chief deputy to the holding cell. Marcus was sitting on the bench, his posture as calm and composed as ever. When the cell door opened, he stood slowly, his eyes locking onto Greg's. There was no anger in his gaze, just a quiet intensity that made Greg's skin crawl. "Mr. Johnson," Roberts said, his voice respectful, almost deferential. "I apologize for this misunderstanding. I assure you, it will be dealt with immediately." Marcus nodded, stepping out of the cell. Greg's mind was racing, his confusion turning to panic. "What's going on?" he blurted out. "Who is this guy?" Roberts turned to him, his expression icy. "Officer Harris, this is Marcus Johnson, the newly appointed Attorney General of the state. Or didn't you bother to check his ID properly?" The words hit Greg like a punch to the gut. His knees nearly buckled as the reality of the situation sank in. Marcus, the man he had arrested, the man he had mocked and belittled, was the Attorney General, the highest law enforcement officer in the state. Greg's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Marcus stepped forward, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Officer Harris," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Do you always treat people this way, arresting them without cause, making assumptions based on the color of their skin? Or was today just a special occasion?" Greg tried to stammer a response, but Marcus cut him off. "You abused your authority today. You targeted me because of who I am, not because of anything I did. And if you're willing to do that to me, I can only imagine how you treat others in this town." The other officers in the station were staring, their faces a mix of shock and discomfort. Roberts stepped in, his voice cold. "Officer Harris, you're suspended effective immediately. Hand over your badge and gun. There will be a full investigation into your conduct." Greg's hands trembled as he complied, his mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. As Marcus walked out of the station, he paused at the door and turned back to Greg. "This isn't just about you," he said. "It's about accountability. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did today. Consider this a wake-up call for you, and for everyone who thinks they can hide behind a badge." And with that, he was gone, leaving Greg standing there, his career and his pride in ruins. The news of what happened at the Brookfield police station spread like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone in town was talking about it. Officer Greg Harris, the man who had once strutted through the streets with an air of invincibility, was now the subject of whispers and sideways glances. His suspension was the talk of the town, and the once respected cop found himself isolated, his colleagues keeping their distance as if his disgrace were contagious. Greg sat at home, staring at the walls, replaying the events of the previous day in his mind. He had never felt so small, so powerless. Meanwhile, Marcus Johnson wasted no time making his presence felt. As the newly appointed Attorney General, he had the authority to push for change, and he intended to use it. He called for a full investigation into the Brookfield Police Department, focusing on allegations of racial profiling and abuse of power. The town, which had long turned a blind eye to such issues, was suddenly forced to confront them. Community meetings were held, and for the first time, people began to speak up about their own experiences with discrimination. Marcus listened to every story, his calm demeanor and genuine empathy earning him the respect of many, but not everyone was on his side. There were those in Brookfield who saw Marcus as an outsider, a disruptor who had no business meddling in their affairs. They defended Greg, arguing that he was a good cop who had made a mistake. He was just doing his job, they said. He didn't know who Marcus was, but Marcus wasn't swayed by their excuses. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said at one of the town meetings. "What matters is how people are treated. No one should be targeted because of the color of their skin. Not in Brookfield, not anywhere." As the investigation unfolded, more stories came to light, stories of other people who had been harassed or mistreated by Greg and others like him. The evidence was damning, and it became clear that Greg's actions were not an isolated incident. They were part of a larger pattern, one that had been ignored for far too long. The town was forced to reckon with its own complicity, and for many, it was a painful awakening. Greg, meanwhile, was left to face the consequences of his actions. His suspension turned into a termination, and he found himself unemployed and unemployable. The once arrogant cop was now a pariah, his reputation in tatters. He tried to reach out to his former colleagues, but they wanted nothing to do with him. Even his friends and neighbors avoided him, as if his downfall might somehow rub off on them. For the first time in his life, Greg was forced to confront the person he had become, and he didn't like what he saw. As for Marcus, he left Brookfield with a sense of cautious optimism. He knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight, but he had planted the seeds. The town would never be the same, and neither would Greg. And as Marcus drove away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Hope that one day justice would prevail not just in Brookfield, but everywhere. The story of Officer Greg Harris and Marcus Johnson is one that will linger in the minds of Brookfield's residents for years to come. It's a story of arrogance and accountability, of prejudice and justice, and ultimately of the power of standing up for what's right. Greg's fall from grace was swift and brutal, a stark reminder that no one is above the law, not even those who are sworn to uphold it. His actions, driven by bias and entitlement, cost him everything: his job, his reputation, and the respect of his community. But more importantly, his story served as a wake-up call for an entire town. Marcus Johnson, on the other hand, emerged as a symbol of hope and change. His calm demeanor and unwavering commitment to justice left a lasting impression on Brookfield. He didn't just expose the flaws in the system. He challenged the town to do better, to be better. And while the road to change is long and fraught with challenges, Marcus's actions proved that it's a road worth taking. His story is a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of holding those in power accountable. As the dust settled, Brookfield began to heal. The conversations sparked by Marcus's visit continued, and slowly but surely, the town started to address the deep-seated issues that had been ignored for too long. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all you need: a start. This story is more than just a tale of one man's downfall and another's triumph. It's a reminder that justice isn't just about punishing the wrongdoers. It's about creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. It's about standing up against prejudice, even when it's uncomfortable. And most importantly, it's about understanding that change begins with us, with our actions, our words, and our choices. And that's the story of how one man's prejudice led to his downfall, and how another man's courage sparked a movement for change. But this isn't just a story about Marcus and Greg. It's a story about all of us. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world. So, what do you think? Did Greg get what he deserved? Was Marcus's response fair? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about accountability, justice, and the power of standing up against prejudice. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Stories like this one are important, and the more people who hear them, the better. And if you're new here, consider subscribing to the channel for more thought-provoking stories that challenge the status quo and inspire change. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Finally, let me know what kind of stories you'd like to see next. Should we dive into another tale of justice and redemption, or explore something completely different? Your feedback helps shape this channel, and I can't wait to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.